Good afternoon. Thank you so much. So I'm going to be building on, I think, a little bit on some of the things that my friend Trevor said in his last talk. How do we build a sustainable information ecosystem for human rights and democracy? I think this is something that's been on the mind of people throughout the Republica conference. So we've come a long way in the past 7 years, from the Arab Spring to Cambridge Analytica. In 2011, we were very optimistic about how social media was empowering activists to hold powerful dictators to account. And by 2017, the conventional wisdom about social media's impact on democracy has flipped to a very negative 180 degrees. But let's be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Global platforms that are not entirely under the thumb of repressive regimes remain a lifeline for many activists and journalists around the world. The challenge now is, how do we get the platforms, how do we get our global information ecosystem that is designed and operated largely by private corporations to support human rights, to support the kind of society we want for our children, while not allowing these platforms to be hijacked into instruments of repression, hate, or mob rule. This is not easy. I think we need to start, and Trevor talked about this a bit, by thinking about what fuels the political economy of our global information ecosystem. That is data, of course, as many people have been talking about throughout this conference, and specifically personal information about everybody who uses and contributes to this ecosystem. That data is fueling this political economy. And we talk about sustainable business. We've been talking about sustainable business for many decades now. How to get business to operate in a way that is sustainable for our environment and for our physical societies. But what about our digital environment, our information ecosystem? Not only should we be worrying about whether the planet's atmosphere will be habitable for future generations, we also need to be asking, what kinds of rights and freedoms do we want to preserve for future generations, and how do we do that? Are we creating an information ecosystem in which our children's rights, our own rights, future generations' rights can be respected and protected? If not, then everybody who contributes to and shapes that information ecosystem needs to take responsibility for their actions. Not only the platforms and services and device companies, but media organizations, governments, of course, and individuals who publish, transmit, and organize activities across this digital ecosystem. We all need to take responsibility for how this is evolving. So, it's possible that there may be some people in the room who've seen me give talks before, and you may have seen a variant of this graphic. But power in the digital age is mediated increasingly through internet and mobile platforms. And people and communities and the relationships with governments, but also movements, all kinds of organizations and corporations are all mediating their relationships and seeking to influence people and communities. We need to make sure that as this evolves, it is indeed producing outcomes that are respectful and protective of the rights of people and communities, and enabling social justice, enabling accountable governance, and not the opposite, not becoming weaponized for disinformation, hate, and demagoguery. Now, what needs to happen, right? Obviously, we need to hold power accountable. So when power is being exercised through platforms and networks, whether that power is being exercised by governments, by your own government, or by some other government that's using platforms to influence other populations, or whether it's corporate power or power that other types of groups, be they humanitarian groups, relatively benevolent groups as people here might see them, or terrorist groups, or political extremists who might seek to manipulate information ecosystems. How are we holding all types of power accountable through these networks? We do need governance. Without governance, when I talk about freedom on the internet, freedom of expression, of course, I think most of us believe that freedom needs to take place in the context of human rights. And you don't have human rights without governance. If you have no governance, then life is nasty, brutish, and short, and whoever has the most resources and who is the largest and strongest wins. That's not the kind of society we want. We want governance, but we want accountable governance. We want to participate in what the rules are, how the political economy is shaped, and we need to make sure it works for everyone. That's the goal. So I would argue that the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which were published several years ago, is a useful guideline given that our information ecosystem is mediated so much by the private sector. And it lays out very helpfully the responsibility for human rights of various actors. Very importantly, governments have the primary duty to protect human rights. I don't think I need to explain to you how and why governments are failing to do this in much of the world and what a problem that is. Companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. So everything that a company has control over, they need to be assessing what kind of impact their business operations, their design, their policies are having on human rights, and govern their businesses, plan their businesses accordingly. We have a lot of failures in that area as well. And both governments and companies have a responsibility to provide remedy, to enable grievance and remedy for those who are harmed when governments and companies are failing to live up to their responsibilities. So I think this is a useful framework to think about who we need to hold accountable in what context. We need corporate commitment to operate in a manner consistent with human rights and social justice, and to design their businesses accordingly, to conduct risk assessments, impact assessments accordingly, and to engage with stakeholders to ensure that they're meeting their commitments and designing their products in a way that actually benefits communities, that benefits the kind of society we want to have. We need commitments by governments, not just to their immediate constituents, but we need commitments by governments. Any government that claims to be democratic, that claims to believe in global human rights, needs to be held accountable to enacting policies and laws that have a positive impact for fundamental freedoms and human rights of people all over the world and internet users all over the world. So that's another way in which many governments are falling short. We need to strengthen civil society and independent journalism very clearly. We need to make sure that policies are, and also the actions of companies, both platforms and also media companies, are actually consistent with that. And media companies are not always as consistent as they might always want to claim, and I'll talk about that a bit more. We also need greater collaboration across sectors and across borders to build the kind of world we want to see, and find allies between civil society and government and corporations of people who share the same vision. So, speaking more on the corporate level, my colleagues and I just launched last week something called the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Accountability Index. And we evaluate 22 of the world's largest internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies on their commitments and disclosures that affect their users' freedom of expression and privacy. Now, I'm not going to go into all the data. It would take several hours. You can go to the website and I'll show the URL, but just go to rankingdigitalrights.org. And you can explore all the data and how everybody stacks up and all the different companies and so on. But I do want to give you a few highlights just to illustrate the ways in which companies need to do much better based on our research. So one of the questions we asked when we evaluated companies was, how transparent are companies being about how they handle user information, from the collection to the use of user information to who they're sharing it with, whether they're giving users sufficient control over both what is collected, how it is used, and with whom it is shared. And this is the graph of, we have, this is an average of several different questions, and that add up to how companies are disclosing their practices and policies around handling of user information. And you'll see that academically everybody failed. There was no score that was above an F. And that the Facebook, now we closed our research earlier in the year before Facebook made its most recent policy announcements. However, their results for the past couple years have been very similar, a real foreshadowing for the kinds of problems we've been seeing over the past year, that Facebook's transparency about how it handles user data has been consistently, for many years, been worse than its peers, and its peers have not been very good. And the telecommunications companies we examined have all been worse than that. When we look specifically at the question of how transparent are internet and mobile ecosystem companies about what user information they share and with whom, a South Korean company in our index actually got the highest score because they have quite strong privacy protections, and you'll see the breakdown there. So a lot more that companies can do just to inform users about what they're doing in order to demonstrate commitments. So this is actually a very low bar in terms of, we're just looking for transparency about what they do. And then there's a lot of other conversations that need to be had about whether their business model is even one that is compatible with the kind of society we want to have. But even baseline in terms of what they're doing, they're not disclosing enough. This is the question, the one indicator of the 35 questions we asked that we like to call the Cambridge Analytical question. How much control do companies give to users about who their data is shared with and what data is shared with and whether it's opt-in or opt-out? And Facebook's level of control it gave users and the disclosure about the level of control users could have was lower than even 2 Chinese and 2 Russian companies as of the beginning of this year. They've made some announcements that have probably moved their score up a little bit, but they have a long way to go. And the entire industry, in terms of the platforms that influence the digital lives of most internet users, all of them have targeted advertising on by default. None of them have opt-in for targeted advertising use. And we'll talk more about why that's an issue. And among the companies we examined, again, we looked at whether any of them disclose how and whether they track users across the internet. Again, very low disclosure. And only one company we evaluated, Apple, even made the commitment not to track users across the internet. Everybody else disclosed poorly, and we're clearly doing it to varying degrees if they disclose anything at all. So this is a blog post written by Doc Searles, who has been working sort of as an advocate for internet users and control over data for many decades now. And he points out an ugly reality, that yes, we're all very focused on Facebook, but how do we all contribute to this situation? And he talks about how Facebook is the tip of the iceberg, and every other website making money from tracking-based advertising is contributing to the problem that we have today. And that, of course, includes most news organizations. So as an example, he pointed to an editorial written, an op-ed written by Zeynep Tufekci, who many of you might know, a very prominent privacy and internet rights activist. She talked about Facebook's surveillance machine in this article in the New York Times. And then Doc did an examination using a tool called Privacy Badger of all the different trackers that the New York Times had on that article, on that website. 13 different potential trackers. So we have a media ecosystem that is feeding this. That in all of its sort of holier than thou, oh, Facebook is destroying journalism and we're great and they're evil, I think the media ecosystem has failed to really acknowledge the extent to which they've been contributing to the problem and the extent to which they have not been advocating for a different approach. This is, don't worry if you can't read anything here, but it's sort of deliberately a mess, unreadable. This is a graphic that Doc Searles also posted on the same blog post, showing the whole ecosystem of companies, both marketing companies, digital tracking companies, data collection companies, that then are helping the publishers monetize their content and enable publishers to know who to target. And which also, of course, enables, this is the part of the ecosystem that Cambridge Analytica came out of, and that enables various actors to weaponize content that feeds into it. So we all need to be thinking about, again, this ecosystem that Zeynep, who I just mentioned, and Shoshana Zuboff, an academic at Harvard, have been calling surveillance capitalism. And we all, Facebook deserves every bit of criticism and condemnation it's gotten, but we all need to look very hard at the role that we are all playing in this ecosystem and how we are enabling it and what we're going to do about it. So I'd like to suggest a way of thinking about this. We've all, I think probably most of the people in the room, unfortunately there's this person who lives in the White House in Washington, D.C. who doesn't believe this, but I think most people do. In this room, perhaps, that excessive dependence on fossil fuels has been contributing to climate change. I would argue that excessive dependence on targeted advertising is contributing to the current situation where platforms are more easily manipulated and gamed, and so the surveillance economy is threatening liberty, justice, equality, and accountable governance. So in other words, just as fossil fuels are an existential threat to our climate, advertising technologies are posing an at least the way in which they are used and deployed and configured today are posing an existential threat to democratic, open societies and accountable governance. So, targeted advertising, the fossil fuel of our information ecosystem. Let's think about that. And if we think about that in that way, what does that mean in terms of how we counter it? And I think all of you know who've been around for a while, it's been decades. The climate movement has been building over decades, working with governments, working to change minds in governments, working to change business models, to push for technical innovation, push for investor awareness, to push for a new approach to an economy that can actually sustain the planet. And so we need to think about what we need to do if we want an information ecosystem that can actually sustain the kind of society we want. So similarly, as we've seen with climate, regulation, obviously. There's good regulation and there's bad regulation. I'll talk about that a bit more. But we need regulation that's going to encourage responsible data practices, greater transparency, and so on, and that pushes business model and innovation in the right direction. We also need to see investment. In fighting climate change, we've seen a lot of investment from both public and private sector in discovering and developing alternative energy sources, alternative ways of generating energy. We need to invest the same level of effort into developing alternative business models and an alternative political economy for the information ecosystem. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to change just because we kind of tweet a lot about it. It's going to take money. It's going to take sacrifice, just as it has with the climate movement. And we need investor pressure. There's trillions of dollars now of funds that are investing in carbon alternatives. So let's think fossil fuel alternatives that are focused on basically incentivizing companies to innovate away from fossil fuels. We need the same kind of pressure in the investment world. Investors are only just starting to think about data accountability in this way. It's time to educate the investor community. And of course, we have a digital rights movement building, an information justice movement building. We need to build it much stronger. I want to talk a little bit about problematic regulation and problematic government practices. There's a lot of censorship around the world. Not only are companies deleting and managing content in ways that aren't really working for civil society, but you're getting government demands demanding that companies censor more and more content online. And in many parts of the world, governments make it very difficult for companies to report on the amount of censorship they're doing in response to government demands, and governments are not being transparent about the demands they're making of companies. So this is an example of internet service providers, telecommunications companies that provide mobile and fixed line data service. Internet websites are being blocked in many parts of the world at very high volumes. And in many countries, the telecommunications providers that we examine, when we ask them why they're not reporting on the volume and data about the number of pages they're getting, the number of requests they're getting from governments, they say they're not allowed in many markets. And so we actually examined in the telecommunications companies we examined, we look for transparency about what are your policies for handling government demands, and do you publish any data about the volume of government demands you get and the nature of those demands. Very few companies publish any information. This is problematic because if you don't know who is exercising power over your access to information under what authority, how do you hold them accountable? How do you know what you don't know? Similarly with network shutdowns, around the world, Germany may not have a problem with network shutdowns. In India, there were over 60 occasions on which internet service was shut off completely in a city or region, mainly for political reasons or sometimes even because students were taking exams. And in many parts of the world, governments do not allow the telecommunications companies to report to their users about the demands they're getting from governments, what the reasons for these demands were, and why their internet access was cut off. Again, this is a real problem with accountability. Also, in the democratic world, understandably, democratic governments are trying to react, trying to demonstrate they're doing something about the real problem of hate speech and disinformation and weaponization of content on the internet. But there's a real concern that governments, and this is an article written by Human Rights Watch criticizing the NetzDG law here in Germany, which is well-intentioned to deal with a real problem. But what human rights activists are finding is that repressive regimes around the world are copying this law and censoring large and demanding, using it to justify the censorship of large amounts of content that they call fake news or that they call hate speech. Anything that isn't positive about a politician in some countries is hate speech. And so we need to be very careful. And this is why I talk about when one government seeks to regulate the internet, they really need to be considering how this is going to affect the rights of internet users all around the world. And we have a problem, one of the dilemmas of democracy is that elected leaders are only considering themselves responsible to the people in their jurisdiction, and they don't consider it their job to care about people in other jurisdictions. And I think if we're going to have an accountable global internet that really serves the rights of all of its users, we need to think about how we can impose greater accountability on governments in their impacts on the global internet. We recently, just the other day, just this week, earlier this week, Article 19 put out this post in which they publicized a joint declaration on media independence and diversity in the digital age. And they basically laid out both what government and other actors need to do if we are going to have the kind of information ecosystem on which independent journalism can thrive, on which kind of facts are not drowned out and attacked, on which you can have reasoned debate. This was signed by David Kaye, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and several other regional rapporteurs, including the Representative of Freedom of the Media for the OSCE, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression for the OAS, the Organization of American States, and the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression and Access to Information for the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights. So it had broad sort of regional support. And they are very concerned that legislation being passed in many countries is not compatible, not sufficiently compatible with international human rights standards, and that this is going to make it easier for more governments to censor more content for political and arbitrary reasons, and there's a failure to be sufficiently transparent. The need to protect journalists and media independence goes without saying. Not enough governments are doing that. The government of my home country included, going very much in the wrong direction, and this is obviously a concern. Surveillance must be necessary and proportionate. This is an area where democratic governments have been going in the wrong direction, yes, we have serious concerns about extremism, we have serious concerns about crime and terrorism, but if you are putting into place surveillance systems that do not have sufficient accountability, that do not have sufficient checks against abuse, that are not going to subject journalists and activists to blanket surveillance when they are not suspected of crimes because the surveillance is so broad. If you do that, you're not going to have a global information ecosystem that is compatible with the kind of world we want to have, with the kind of rights we want for future generations. And democracies are failing to lead the way in how you properly balance the need for security with the need for protecting rights. They're not setting a good example, and that is making things even harder in the rest of the world. We do not have sufficient transparency, even by democratic governments, both in terms of what demands are being placed on companies for surveillance. There's very little transparency. We're not seeing transparency reports by governments about the volume and nature of demands they're making. We don't need to know about every single case and all the details, but just some data. Many governments in the democratic world have signed up to the Open Government Partnership, and they are not adhering to open government principles when it comes to how their surveillance laws work and how their demands and requests are working. They are also not being transparent and accountable about censorship demands being made, about demands for blocking content or restricting content. This is also an area where democratic governments are failing to lead the way. I'd like to point out, before I end, there is an organization that's actually not as well known as one might imagine, called the Freedom Online Coalition. And it's now been around for about 7 years, and it's a coalition of governments who claim to be committed to advancing a free and open internet. The question is, are they themselves at home enacting the right policies and setting the right examples? And they are having their annual conference here in Berlin later this year. So I encourage all of you to pay attention and to really ask, go on the website and look at the principles that these governments have signed up for and ask them some tough questions about whether they themselves are living up to these principles at home. And think about how we hold them accountable to these principles that they claim to have signed up on. So that's another thing we can do. So just to come back to my environmental analogy, the first Earth Day was in 1970. The Paris Climate Agreement was only very recently. These movements take time. We now have a situation where even though a major government has basically failed to support It's Paris commitments. You have companies that are stepping up because they feel it's in their own interest to live by the commitments, even if their home government is not committing. You have states in the United States that are pledging to adhere to the climate commitments, even if their national government is not. And this is all because so many different governmental and corporate entities feel that it has now become in their interest to demonstrate that they're being responsible actors. Are there problems? Yes. Are there lots of hypocrisies? Yes. But have we actually seen some serious innovation away from total dependence on fossil fuels? Have we moved the needle since 1970? I would argue yes. We're in a much better place than if there had been no climate movement, that's for sure. And so how do we, I think perhaps we're somewhere around kind of Earth Day as far as the internet, sort of the information justice and rights movement is concerned. And so how do we think about how we coordinate systematically? What are the levers? What are the incentives to move our information political economy from where it is today in the direction of where it needs to go? And the fight never ends, and the setbacks will never stop, as we see with the climate fight. And there are always disappointments, but there can be many victories. And so the question is, you have several $1 trillion of investments, for example, that are specifically targeting alternative fuels. And how do we get that kind of commitment from investors to incentivize business models that are not dependent on targeted advertising? How do we get investors to divest in target advertising dependent companies? That's a question to ask. How do we get governments to commit to invest and support business models and independent media that does not depend on targeted advertising in order to exist, in order to deliver quality journalism, quality debate and information to its audiences? We need to see that commitment. That's going to require investment. It's going to require public investment. It's going to require private investment, just as we've seen tremendous investment in the energy field, alternative energy field. We need the same level of commitment. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a constant struggle to keep things moving in the right direction. But if we work just as hard as the climate movement has been working for many decades, we can move forward. We can move our information ecosystem onto a better track. But we're going to have to do a lot more than just tweet about it. We're going to have to put our money where our mouth is. We're going to have to put our careers on the line for what we believe in, or we won't get there. But thank you very much. And I'll take questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Please raise your hands.
I have a discussion.
Traut euch.
Comments? Critiques? Objections?
Kommentare?
So if there's no immediate questions, I'm going to ask the audience a question. How many of you have a pension fund or a retirement investment fund? How many of you, among those of you who do, how many of you are investing in socially responsible funds or clean energy funds, sustainability funds, and that kind of thing? How many of you have ever seen on offer from your mutual fund company a fund that also includes in its criteria privacy? So there we are. I don't know of one. I think there are some funds that kind of generally in their criteria engage with companies, but we need to start seeing demand for that kind of thing. That's I think the kind of thing we need to see, among other things.
So, over here. Hi, thank you for your talk. I just have a question how to make the conversation more accessible to people, because I think the climate change discussion was successful in that it made people realize it had something to do with their future or the future of the planet. Whereas the discussion you've presented seems more abstract, more political, more technical, and I don't think it hits people in the same way. Aside from being somewhat of a political scandal, how do we make it a real-life issue that people actually get involved with?
That's a really good question. And it is harder, definitely. But the climate change discussion didn't become accessible overnight. You know, in 1970, in the first Earth Day, it was a much more elite technical thing. So I think certainly both when it comes to the Snowden revelations and the Facebook Cambridge Analytica, we are seeing a public that's much more aware than they were just 5 years ago, in my experience, that ordinary people are more aware of these issues than they were before. And certainly when you travel to some countries where the internet is heavily censored, people feel it very directly a lot. But it's not always visible in the developed world as much. I think it's also important, just as it is with the kind of environmental sustainability debate, for people to understand linkages, so that when journalists and activists are not free to speak online, for example, in a country like Russia, or they're drowned out and discredited and intimidated in parts of the Middle East, let's say in Egypt, it becomes much harder for progressive voices from many of these countries to be heard, and then it actually results in a more threatening geopolitical situation for all of us. It like hurts our security. And so the ability of people all around the world to speak freely online is actually in the interest, if we want more secure and stable societies. The less freedom there is around the world to speak and to hold government accountable, the more insecure we are going to end up being. And that's something I think in media reporting and storytelling there may not be enough understanding of as well.
So it goes on here.
Hello, my name is Michelle Bensing. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just got a quick question because I'm really interested in the media relating, and I'm wondering how can we create more conscience for media actually using targeting advertisement in general and in the future? Do you have maybe more information about different media organizations who are using this? Because if the media is doing itself, how shall we prevent governments or other companies to use it actually at the end? Yeah,
it's a real problem. Now there are online tools that are free, like Privacy Badger, that you can download and use that will tell you, how many trackers are on a given news website that you visit. And I've actually talked to some people in some journalism schools that we need to have a ranking of major news organizations about kind of the tracking tools that they're using, and we need to kind of name and shame media organizations a bit more in terms of the tactics they're using. On the other hand, it's easy to be sympathetic to news organizations because their revenues have all been going down as well, because of all kinds, the collapse of conventional advertising. But there is a question about, okay, so let's not belabor too long sort of what people should have done differently to prevent getting into this situation, and kind of think about what we want media to do going forward. And it certainly is difficult because news organizations will say, well, if I can't rely on targeted advertising for revenue, then I'm going to have to put up a paywall, and I'm going to have to get subscriptions, and I'm going to have even more trouble supporting my journalists. Which brings us to an even bigger existential problem, which is that if we believe journalism is a public good, should we be paying for it with tax money? Should those of us who can afford subscriptions be paying for it more? Do we just say to media companies, it's your problem, you fix it because you've been contributing to it, or have we been contributing to it too? And do we, as the audience, the people formerly known as the audience, or do we as kind of actors in this ecosystem also need to take responsibility and support alternatives as well, and contribute to them? So that's another issue which is very difficult to solve. We're going to need a great deal of innovation, in terms of public support for media, as well as alternative business models. My friend Trevor was, he does call into question, whether a capitalist economy can really support a public interest news media. I think that's a very good question to ask. And what does that mean? How do we fix it? I'm not smart enough to come up with a grand solution, other than to say we have a lot of work to do, I think, over a very long period of time. But that the status quo, if we just keep it going the way it is, we're not going in a good direction.
Okay, we have one last question here in the last row.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Tanya. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on alternative business models, because just a few days ago in the hearing of Mark Zuckerberg in court, he was actually criticized when they were discussing in terms of not using advertising as the business model, but charging the user.
Right.
And he was criticized because they said, well, so you're going to make the users pay in order not to use their data. And I was just wondering if you had some views on that.
Yeah, that's also a question, right? So do only people who pay get privacy and everybody else is the product? I mean, that also doesn't sound like a good model. There are some smaller companies that are experimenting with other types of business models that are more geared towards revenue sharing with the user with their data. So rather than making them pay, making them kind of part of the business, as it were. And sort of an actor in this ecosystem with more control, both over who gets to see their data and who gets paid for it, and so on. So there are some experiments going on. There are also experiments going on in what might a more responsible data marketplace look like that has much more constraints and much more user agency over those marketplaces. We're very much in early days, and it would be good to I think there's a lot of reporting and research that could be done to really kind of highlight and compare what is going on in different places. Doc Searles, who I mentioned earlier, has been involved with a number of projects for a number of years, trying to sort of get enough funding around alternative market, sort of data and information marketplace models that are not so exploitative of the user, and that there are other choices beyond, okay, you're the product and I sell you, or you pay for the service. That, Mark Zuckerberg kind of made it seem like there's just two choices. And actually, if there's enough investment and intention and intention and attention, I think other alternatives can be developed. But at the moment, they're fairly experimental because they haven't scaled.
So I think that's it. Oh no, one more question.
Thank you very much for your talk. Fully agree with everything you said, and it's not so much a question, but you've mentioned investments. There is a movement here für die kritischen Aktionäre, Dachverband der kritischen Aktionäre, the critical shareholders, who try to get companies to behave a bit more positively, but the investment companies, the fund companies, the pension companies, they are not reacting yet really. So we don't even have proper green investments here in Germany, which is especially embarrassing. These kind of subjects, we put them to the table, they don't they don't even listen.
Right.
We have the climate change still to fight for.
Yeah.
However, there is maybe a business model you might be interested in. We have a very small newspaper here, Die Tageszeitung. It's a cooperative company, so only people own it, and we pay for it. Yeah. And it's so independent, it doesn't even need advertising. It takes advertising, but it could publish without it. And they publish all their online content and have a little message, please pay for it if you can. So everybody who can't pay gets the news, but everybody who can afford to pay every now and then extra euros, they can. And they made that possible. That's actually working. And The Guardian in London is copying this as well now. Right. They don't have a paywall, but they ask for the people who can afford it to pay for it. And that seems to work now as well. Mm-hmm. So as you were talking about alternatives, I thought you might be interesting in European alternatives that start working.
That's really great. Yeah, I hope somebody out there could sort of create a website that's sort of listing all the different alternatives and sort of devoted to, or maybe there is such a hub already, or perhaps someone here at Republica might be interested in creating one that's sort of devoted to discussion and kind of sharing of practices, shared learning around business models. Because I hear about these types of things in various places, and there do seem to be some success stories. And it also seems to work particularly. I mean, one of the big problems we have with our information ecosystem now is kind of hollowing out of local media. And so to the extent that this can be a model for local media to thrive and so on is important too. Yeah. Great.
So I think that's it. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you.